Nick is the E-Town host and founder and CEO for E-Town. He's no stranger to the world of music. He began his career as a professional musician more than 30 years ago and was a founding member of the world-renowned bluegrass band Hot Rise, and continues as a record producer, session musician, touring sideman, and as a leader of the respected E-Town house band, E-Tones.
Thank you for inviting me. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to speak to you. And in this, I'm sure you've had a great conference and learned all kinds of stuff, right? I'm sure, the anomaly as opposed to the norm in terms of your keynote speakers this week, in that I come from really just the perspective of a passionate citizen who's trying to do the right thing. And because of my role as a musician and because of my role as the executive director and founder of a nonprofit organization, I have had an opportunity to actually make some decisions along the way that are relevant to the conversation you guys have been having. I'll give you a little bit of background, and then I'll talk more specifically about the project we've been working on the last couple of years. Actually, it's been longer than that, but construction just finished after 2.5 years. E-Town Hall is a building in downtown Boulder that was something I've been very passionate about for a number of years, and I'll give you a tiny little bit of background first. Obviously, what this conference is about and what we're talking about is looking for practical applications for the things that we care about, so that we can actually look for ways in which we can infuse in our communities some simple changes that can substantially sort of alter the dynamic in terms of how we use resources and how we interact with each other. Some of those have to do with design, some of those have to do with policy, some of those have to do with government, but all of them really are about our personal journeys and our personal opportunity to interact with our neighbors on behalf of the things we care about. We are the lucky ones here today. We are rich enough to where these concerns are high on our list, higher in fact than survival and safety and food for our families and so on. So we are among the lucky ones. We're informed, we're educated, we're passionate, we have an opportunity to have these opinions and make them known and share them. So I think this is it's a critical time and it's a critical conversation. Surprisingly, I live in Boulder, Colorado, and people think about Boulder probably not unlike the way they think about Fort Collins, as being a progressive town, and would instantly embrace all kinds of the issues and the opportunities that I was presenting to the city with this renovation project called E-Town Hall. It was not that simple, and it wasn't really at any point an easy process. I'll just give you a tiny little bit of background on how I arrived at this position in my life, really. I used to be introduced on stage as the only man in the world who was born in Beirut, Lebanon, who was bitten by a weasel, and who's played on the Grand Ole Opry. And those three things are true. I was born in Beirut. My dad was in the State Department for a while, and we lived in the Middle East in the mid-50s. I grew up in the Hudson River Valley of New York. And there was, around that time and in the community in which I lived, a conservation ethic. And it was primarily among the landed gentry a sense of noblesse oblige. We must take care of this beautiful landscape, and we're going to fight development of power plants and housing developments and other things. But it was a sort of an aristocratic effort, not particularly scientific effort. It was more about preserving vistas and preserving a sense of history. But nonetheless, I got to see it, and I got to be around it, and I lived in a beautiful place. I also got to watch Pete Seeger, when I was 12 years old, begin his effort to clean up the Hudson River using music. And that was a very profound experience for me, just to see someone recognize that music can build community. Pete had this vision of trying to clean up the Hudson, and he wanted to build a boat, a replica of an old 19th century sloop. And his concept was, if you could raise money and build the boat, sail the boat up and down the river, at every stop, musicians would file out of the boat and play in these different towns, and it would sort of turn these small towns along the Hudson, change their sense of what the river was for them, rather than thinking of it as a dump or as an easy disposal spot for raw sewage or chemical waste or whatever it was. He really just wanted to shift their consciousness into thinking of the river as a beautiful and valuable natural resource and economic engine for these downtowns. And at one point in particular, I remember this one event where there was the Hudson Valley Philharmonic playing, a songwriter named Don McLean, who was written the song called American Pie, and Pete. And there's this big kind of mob of angry, I guess they were VFW guys, I'm not sure exactly, but they had hard hats on and baseball bats and 2x4s, and they had a big banner that said, "Don't clean up the river. Clean up this country. Get rid of commies like Pete Seeger." And so two things happened that were relevant for me and perhaps for you. One is that my mother, who was a feisty artist and painter and just feisty woman, had a little rap on, and she marched to the front of this group and covered up their banner because it offended her. And then the Hudson Valley Philharmonic director decided to play the Star Spangled Banner, at which point these guys who were really looking for a fight, and the crowd was sort of bristling with this intensity that was going to become a riot. All of a sudden, with the Star Spangled Banner, these guys had to take their hard hats off and sing. So the whole thing turned into a sing-along in about a minute. It transformed from being this tense, potential conflict to being a sing-along. And so that was a great lesson for me as I then embarked on my career as a musician. And I was lucky enough to play all over the world and do a bunch of stuff and see firsthand the way music builds community and brings people together and cuts across boundaries and borders, in my view, better than anything else. So that led me to start E-Town when Hot Rise, well, I guess I was still playing in some other bands, but anyway, I was inspired to start E-Town after a trip that I took to Eastern Europe. And what I saw in 1990 in Eastern Europe was that when government and industry are the same thing, the environment takes a tumble. It was palpable. The air in Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, and we were there for a couple of days. I was playing with Sam Bush and some other musicians. Great shows and big crowds and all this stuff, but you couldn't see really through more than a few blocks on a spring day in this town because of coal dust in the air, and you could see that the water was foul and that agricultural, sort of systems were not working well. And the last piece of this puzzle is just that I'm a dad. I have 3 kids, and I came home from that trip in 1990 thinking, okay, I'm going to use the power of music to bring people together with media and try to educate people about our roles and our opportunities to take better care of our communities and our planet. So that was the sum total of my inspiration. A year later, the first E-Town show was recorded on Earth Day in 1991. We are currently broadcast on about 300 radio stations, and we've been on the air for more than 21 years. So that has been an amazing opportunity for me to do exactly what I had set out to do, which is use music to pull people together and then try to educate and inform and inspire people around individual actions that we can each take in our communities on behalf of the planet, on behalf of future generations. That's the genesis of how E-Town started. The next thing that's relevant for all of you here today is just simply that starting about 20 years ago, I started looking for a permanent home for E-Town. And I came across this old church in downtown Boulder that had been kind of underutilized. And it was a curious structure. It was a space that had been built by the congregation over the period of about 5 decades, and pieces and parts, and it lost whatever architectural integrity it had. But it had these cool spaces that I recognize as being ideal for our purposes, that included the sanctuary, which is about a 200-seat gathering space. It had the old cafeteria, which I could envision would be a nice kind of a cafe or coffee house. It had an old gymnasium, which I imagine could be a great recording studio. And then it had 3 floors of office space, which I thought would work well for administrative offices and dressing rooms and editing rooms for our purposes. So I began the process of trying to get the city to agree that this would be a good idea. It's a non-conforming space in a mixed-use neighborhood, and I was rebuffed many times, primarily because of zoning. Eventually, I was frustrated enough to where the city said, well, you can't do this because you're not a church. So I went online and I got ordained, and it took about 5 minutes. And then I went down to the city with my certificate of ordination, and I said, okay, here's the deal. I'm an ordained minister. E-Town's a 501c3, just as churches are. We often do our programs on Sunday evenings. We celebrate good works in the community, and we do a lot of singing. And if you need us to be a church, we can do that. And that was a stunner for the folks in the planning department, and something that they were not looking forward to because, unbeknownst to me, churches have a miraculous diplomatic immunity that they can do whatever they want, apparently. But anyway, so that got their attention, and that began this process. So then began the real critical thing, which is be careful what you wish for, because suddenly we found ourselves the owners of a really horrible building. And it was filled with asbestos and mildew, and it was poorly constructed, and it was an old stone church, and then the new structures had been added onto with using cement block, and never was there an architect or an engineer or a building permit invited to participate in any of this process over the course of the decade. So it was very funky. And then the next part of the challenge was, how do we make our values manifest in this process? How do we can't just do a building. We have to do a building that reflects the kinds of things that we've been talking about on E-Town for 21 years. Starting in 1991, I began by interviewing scientists from the National Center for Atmospheric Research and others talking about this concept, climate change. I interviewed Amory Lovins and others talking about renewable energy, talking about energy conservation, talking about this concept he had for this hybrid motor that might work and all this other stuff. So we were deep into this conversation. And so it would have been disingenuous for us not to embrace all of those aspects while renovating this building. The challenge that I faced immediately was that everybody wanted to use the latest gadgets and all the fanciest bells and whistles in order to create a green building. And so along this process, I started just referring to something I called common sense stewardship. It's not about the latest technology. It's about what makes good sense as you're going through this process. We were able to reuse a lot of materials from the demolition. We were able to capitalize on some of the integrity of the structure. You can see some of the stone there. We had to pour all new slabs in the basement, but we did move wood, for example, wood floors from one space to another. And this is a particular process that was involved with sound mitigation. It's a puck system that produces acoustic isolation, so it's, also creates a nice thermal barrier. And it's interesting because this project had essentially 4 key elements in our hierarchy that guided us through this renovation. Number 1, we defined failure as making all these spaces, raising the money, building this building, and having the spaces not sound good. So acoustics became our primary concern. Number 2, we wanted to make sure that we made a green building, that it was an environmental story that worked really well. Number 3, obviously, was the aesthetics. We wanted to make it look and feel good. And number 4 was the budget. So for a nonprofit organization, I'm pretty confident that that was an upside-down hierarchy. But we were able to stick with our values as we got this process going, primarily because we assembled a wonderful team. We had a great acoustical engineer. I assembled some great mechanical engineers, did all the energy modeling, good architects, great contractor, all the subs were great. The bottom line is, no one had ever built a building like this before because of this particular hierarchy. Because the acoustics were driving, the mechanical engineers, for example, couldn't just penetrate walls that we had spent thousands of dollars to separate and isolate with an air duct. We had to use duct silencers and duct wrap and duct liners and re-engineer everything for acoustics. But also, thankfully, there was a nice overlap between the energy efficiency piece and the acoustics piece. So it wasn't, they weren't always at odds with each other. We did have some problems, for example, because the building's built to the lot line, so we couldn't harvest any of our rainwater, or actually even divert it into our gardens. We weren't allowed to do that by the city. I had to fight the city on the number of bike racks we could put on our lot because the arborist wasn't sure that the bike racks would be good for the tree balls, the tree roots. Even the selection of trees we had to sort of do a little battle with the city about, because I didn't want to have the canopies too tall, given the fact that we had put 56 kilowatts of photovoltaic panels on the roof. So things like that, thinking about that interaction among the various city departments and working within the confines of the rules and bending the rules as needed as we went along this process. The net result is the building is now open. It is not completed, but it's quite a remarkable transformation. And our energy model was incorrect. It actually underestimated the percentage of power we could generate on site. We are currently producing over 90% of our power on site from our PV array. We also didn't run natural gas lines into the building intentionally. So the entire HVAC system is electric. We have a very innovative lighting system using almost all LEDs, including our stage lights. And in some cases, we were pushing the envelope because these systems weren't ready yet, particularly around LEDs and dimming. That was it was a kind of a dismal, just sea of misinformation from the manufacturers and talking about, oh, we have these, our engineering reports show that this dimmer is compatible with this light fixture, when in fact it wasn't. For one reason or another, it would produce flickering, it would turn off early, and so on. So we ended up really working closely with a lot of the manufacturers to help refine and perfect some of the systems that we put in place. I resisted the temptation to use daylight sensors or occupancy sensors or some of the systems that are, in my view, well-intentioned but perhaps a little bit overkill, primarily because I figured if I can't hire people who are smart enough to turn their lights on and off or open their windows, then I have other problems. So that was my main rationale for choosing, and of course anybody who's been through a major project like this knows there's thousands of decisions, and every one of them has that full range of impacts and opportunities to learn about where the stuff comes from, where it goes, and so I found myself having to educate myself about all of these issues, because even though I had a great contractor and architect and engineers and so on, this was new for everybody. I was using a lot of used materials from the local resource yard, and we were giving a lot of materials to the resource yard. I know you have one here in Fort Collins too. And so our contractor was a good sport about that, even though it's the last thing in the world he wanted to do. Hey, guess what? I got all this great flooring donated that's, came out of a demolition, and I'm so happy about it. And he was like, okay, we're going to be pulling nails, and we're going to be, I'm going to have to talk to the flooring guys, and, it's going to cost you more. It's like, I know, it's okay, it's going to be good. But basically, I just wanted to sort of summarize by saying that this is a microcosm of the kinds of decisions that we all are making, whether we're involved with municipal government, whether we're doing city planning, whether we're homeowners, whether we are just individuals trying to do the right thing or learn more about how we can do this. I was so fortunate, in my view, to be basically given this opportunity to understand the interaction of disciplines and the interaction of opportunities and challenges that were presented during this process. I'm sure there will be things as we get to know the building a little better that I will imagine, boy, I wish we had done this differently, or we could have tried this. The fact of the matter is, it's something we're very proud of. I think it's amazing to see the musicians who come to see E-Town and come and walk through the building to just embrace the concept that we've created essentially a community center for the arts, for media, and for spreading this message. Because while I share I forget the three fundamental tenets of this conference: learn, share, activate, engage, yeah. Good ones. I like all those. And I think they're critical. But I think there's a missing piece too, which is it also has to be amplified. There's an opportunity for us to learn from each other, to share information that we've gleaned, to engage wherever we can in whatever way we do naturally. But the critical thing is there an opportunity to amplify, to leverage this learning and share this message in a broader way? And with that in mind, I'm particularly pleased about what we've created with eTown Hall, because it is an opportunity to basically reach a lot of people. And every time we open the doors, the fact that over 90% of our energy is coming from our own roof is a reminder that the technology exists now, that these kinds of choices are possible now. We use something, Mitsubishi makes something called a City Multi-System. That's a heating and cooling system that we experimented with, and so far we're very happy with the results. Extremely efficient system. It's easy for us to condition spaces as we use them and not necessarily condition spaces that are being unused, including office by office if someone's on vacation and so on. We've learned a lot, but I think what's happened now is that as people come through a public space, the choices that we made are obvious, the systems that we put in place are working, and they leave knowing that this is possible. So whether or not that's part of our message on every show, whether eTown eventually produces television shows or short-form videos or other things that are about the kinds of things that we're doing and remind people that this is possible. I just want to say that I'm basically just an inspired dad. That's the main thing. You know, I'm not trained, I'm not educated in this arena. I'm well-traveled, and I'm a curious person. But most of these decisions and most of my commitment to the kinds of things I've been focused on, and the reason I've decided to start eTown and dedicate a big chunk of my creative adult life to this project, is that I'm a dad, and now I'm a grandfather. And I would feel remiss, knowing what I know, had I not tried to use my skills and my talents on behalf of my values. So that's a high-class opportunity, as I said before. These are things that not everyone has an opportunity to do. I feel very fortunate. But at the same time, you know, I'm a lucky guy in that I can either walk or ride my bike to work every day. I have a solar thermal panel on my house that generates hot water, mostly for the times that we need it. We've created this building that's largely, you know, energy self-sufficient. I belong to a CSA that's literally 4 blocks from my house, so I get a lot of local and organic groceries. I eat lower on the food chain. I haven't eaten beef in 40 years, and you know, all of these things. I drive a used hybrid, you know, on and on and on. And all of those things, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't matter, you know. My choices, my decisions, the things that I've chosen to do, the way we've chosen to live, isn't really impactful as a standalone series of activities or choices. It doesn't matter. What does matter is if I share those decisions with people I know and use my opportunity in media to share what I've learned through these choices with 500,000, 750,000 people, 1 million people every week, slowly but surely, without being preachy, without being condescending, without scolding. I just simply want to engage people in the idea that we can all do something, and now's the time. And that's basically been my sort of my inspiration and the driving force behind eTown. And I do feel like we all have something to learn from each other. And I think that if we can look for those ways of amplifying the message and reaching more people, and whether it's through, I mean, there's millions of ways to do it. But I think it's critical that we do it, and I think it's critical that we do it now. Thanks again for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. I know that the deep-seated rivalry between Fort Collins and Boulder could have prevented me from being included in an event like this. You overcame that. Anyway, any questions about either E-Town or the building or anything like that?
Just a comment and maybe something on lessons learned that might really carry forward from this is your discussion about acoustics and how it relates to high performance or green buildings. It's maybe a little known or somewhat buried fact that a great many, quote, green buildings have terrible acoustics in them.
Right.
In fact, Bill Ritter was talking about that related to a building down at Andrel earlier. So I think that's one that you could, anyway, it's something the industry needs to understand better and hear. So.
Yeah, and I think that there are different aspects to the category of acoustics when you're talking about public spaces or buildings of any kind. One is isolation. In other words, preventing the sound from one space being transferred into another space. And there's an entire discipline around, I learned so much about this process. And it's really about decoupling structural spaces from each other. So, for example, we have in the cafe, which is directly underneath our performance space, we have drywall hanging on springs that's attached to the floor joists, so that the ceiling is decoupled from the floor plane. And then similarly, the floor joists are attached to the walls using these rubber isolators. The drywall is attached to studs using something called Isomax clips. There's rubber isolators underneath the stage, particularly to keep low end from being transferred into the structure. And the studio and the performance space, that puck system ended up being about 5.5 inches tall that involved air gaps and material of different densities to, again, isolate sound from getting from one place to another. The other issue, which I think is probably more relevant to something like what Bill Ritter was talking about, is sound reflection. Now, when you're in a space where there's a lot of hard surfaces and a lot of glass, and that tends to be green buildings, they want to have a lot of natural light, they want to have a lot of, view corridors and opportunities for open spaces. Those tend to be very reflective. And as a result, pretty miserable spaces as soon as you put 40 people in there. It's challenging. And there is another whole science to that. One part of it involves diffusion, and there's ways to create reflective but irregular surfaces that will break up a sound wave without absorbing it. So if you don't want the space to become too dead, you can use different types of diffusers. And it's pretty interesting based on some variations of the Fibonacci sequence where they create these irregular surfaces and at different depths. And it's a beautiful science, and some of the products are really actually beautiful too. The other, of course, is absorption and just using air gaps, fiberglass panels wrapped in fabric, and looking for ways to essentially trap sounds. And you can trap different frequencies, low frequency bass traps and other things too. So it's a fascinating science. We used a company called SIA Acoustics. They're based in New York and Los Angeles. And this particular acoustical engineer, who's the one who designed and built Jazz at Lincoln Center and the Tonight Show and lots of studios all around the world. I called him because he was recommended and nobody thought we could afford him. And I said, excuse me, Mr. Burko, my name is Nick Forster. I'm doing this project in Boulder, and maybe you could recommend somebody be more affordable. And he said, Nick Forster from Boulder. Used to be in Hot Rise, right? I used to see you guys play at the Bottom Line all the time. What can I do for you? So it was great. He would kill me if he heard me imitate his accent, but the fact is he's very good at what he does, and he helped a lot. And he's very knowledgeable also, and has done so many projects that it was very comfortable for him to interact with mechanical engineers and structural engineers during the process. Sorry if I over-answered your question.
I work in the appraisal world, commercial appraisal world, and I get asked questions about how to get projects like this funded. Now, I don't know if you were able to get any banks involved, but can you address that at all?
Sure, yeah. it was a very complex process that involved the very first bank loan which we got was just allowed us to purchase the building. And for that, I asked the seller to be a co-signer on it. And so the seller was a well-known developer in Boulder, was able to co-sign on a first mortgage. Then I worked with an entity called Public Radio Capital, which is a kind of it's an investment pool from a variety of foundations designed primarily to help public broadcasters acquire buildings and or signals for public television, public radio. Those funds, while available to us, were not inexpensive, and so it was a pretty steep interest rate, and there was a lot of upfront charges and legal fees. But that was an opportunity for us to at least, we phased our project, so we did the beginning phase, so we did just our offices so we could move in. And then we began in earnest our just fundraising efforts to try to raise private donations and foundation dollars. And as it turns out, the project it's about a $7 million project. And I've raised a little over $5 million so far. So there's about $2 million left to raise, some of which is that existing first mortgage and some other loans. It was not easy, especially because it's such a non-conforming space. I also was pretty brazen in terms of trying to get support for, I did get some funding from the governor's energy office that Governor Ritter set up to offset some of our costs for some of the renovations and retrofitting we were doing. I got some support from the city of Boulder. I got obviously some support from Excel, and but for the most part, it was just sort of knocking on doors. Yeah, we had an E-Town show there last night at the at E-Town Hall, and it's interesting. It's I've been it's an entirely new experience having our own venue. It's kind of like I was explaining to someone the other day. If you had your a big birthday party and you had your party at a restaurant, you would be focusing on your friends and having fun and hanging out. If you had the party at your house, you'd be occasionally worried about, well, do we have enough ice? Do we see, is there enough food? How's the grill doing? Is everything okay? So what about parking? Is everything, so I'm having a little bit of those issues, just like we have the shows in our own place, and I'm just thinking about, did somebody check to make sure there's toilet paper in the women's room? And it's a whole new range of issues. But for the most part, the most exciting thing is that it sounds great. It sounds great. We've created something that we were hoping to, and it's filling a gap in Boulder. There was not a mid-sized performance space. And I understand the Bohemian Foundation is going to be fixing up the Armory building downtown as another sort of small, mid-sized performance space here in town. And I shared Sam Burko and SIA Acoustics with them, so they're bringing in some of those folks too to make sure it sounds good. So again, what an amazing organization to have here in Fort Collins that's so dedicated to music and community and doing so many good things for the community. Thanks so much for allowing me to come up and share what little I know, and good luck. Thanks.